Hello, my name's Alexis Bateman, and I'm a research scientist with the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics and director for MIT Sustainable Supply Chains. I'm really excited to join today for the Sustainable Business Summit to talk about supply chain sustainability, but more specifically, supply chain transparency, which is very much critical to sustainable business. So I'll just jump right in since we only have a little bit of time today. But this is some of the work we have ongoing at our center, and I'll be sharing some of our learnings and where we see some of our work demonstrating where the future is going to go. So this is a visual from a research project on gauging the state of supply chain sustainability, of which we were able to see which companies are seeing pressure for more supply chain sustainability and where are those sources coming from. And if you see here really quickly that about 46% of companies are experiencing pressure to increase their supply chain sustainability. But the other interesting factor is that the sources are diffuse across government, mass media, executives, consumers, investors. So it's not just one particular source that is pressuring for supply chain sustainability. And so from that, we can say there are numerous sources of pressure, but what is being looked for, and some of which we're seeing that supply chain transparency is in key demand. And the headlines over daily, we see headlines such as this, which is bringing this recognition that companies are being held responsible for what is happening in their supply chain, not just their own operations, but the impact from their supply chain, and whether that be in the case of here, some labor issues deep in the supply chain, and/or environmental impacts of the products that they source and manufacture and produce. And so the coverage is increasing, and there's a greater awareness, not just by these stakeholders, but also the lay consumer that is recognizing that companies have major supply chains and they have social and environmental impact. Added to the fact that it's not just the news coverage and/or consumer pressure, there's actually an increasing regulatory due diligence in place that is requiring companies to actually report what is happening deep in their supply chain. So you'll see a quick visual put out by another organization that is demonstrating the increasing amount of regulation requiring due diligence, which means that you need to report on, in this case, forced and human traffic labor within your supply chain, that there isn't that, of course. And this comes along with the need for greater visibility and, of course, supply chain transparency. So, what is the definition of supply chain transparency? One of which, I think many are kind of exploring in their day to day, which is, we know that this is a pressure, but what does it constitute? And so we define it, which is, really two parts. And I'll just build this out real quick, which is that visibility, which is actually knowing what's happening in your supply chain. So, accurately identifying and collecting data from links in your supply chain to be able to ensure that you have social and environmental compliance for which your supply chain is in order. The other part is the disclosure, which is to what extent are you sharing with your external stakeholders that you have that visibility? So, of course, it won't be everything that you know about your supply chain, but there's that external communication part that you are doing your due diligence, and hopefully a few steps beyond that to have greater supply chain sustainability socially and environmentally. So what is involved in getting that visibility, which, this is just a quick summary analysis of getting the visibility into the supply chain, some of which we've been investigating, which is there's really kind of three different parts to getting that visibility. One of which is capturing that information across the supply chain. So how is that information being gauged, at the warehouse, at the DC, on the shipping mode, at source of production, all across the supply chain, there's information coming in about practices. So whether that be, actual barcodes, scanners, any kind of mobile phone gauge that can say what's happening at that point and be able to transfer that information along the supply chain. Next of which comes this transmission and upload, which is sharing across the supply chain. So how do we actually share information between players in the supply chain? So moving that information that you've gauged on site into a global or cloud system to be able to share that between players. And the last component of enabling visibility to have more supply chain transparency, which be the access and actionability, which is providing access to that information, which is a key part of supply chain transparency. The information isn't important just at the site or just at the single node or player in the supply chain. There's a greater need to share information between players and, of course, have that full story about your supply chain further downstream, whether that be for the end customer or, in some cases, the consumer, to be able to not just kind of inform the downstream or your customer, but that there are actions you need to take about what you're learning in the supply chain. So this is just a brief summation of different technologies in place that we're examining. And so, what is supply chain transparency in terms of mainstream different company examples? So here, probably the most famous example is the Patagonia footprint chronicles, of which when they came out and they really mapped the full supply chain of some of their products. So they said, where is the cotton coming from? Where are the buttons being sewn on? Who is working at those plants, and what life it had before it reached your hand? And so this was something that came out in 2010, almost a decade ago, and really came out sort of this seminal and first iteration of very heavy supply chain transparency that was open to the public. But it's really grown in prominence, and you probably see in your supermarket different barcodes or different information that you can learn about the product you buy. For instance, here's a cereal or some seafood that you can scan with a QR code to learn who the fisherman was, who were the wheat farmers that actually were a part of that product, and learn more about the real story behind the supply chain for each product. And when we really know it's becoming quite mainstream and that there's an imperative and a need for more supply chain transparency is, recently Amazon actually listed their full list of suppliers, and now disclosing for their branded products, providing more information. So of which, when major companies are pivoting to be able to put in place what they need to disclose different parts of their supply chain. Of course, there's a long journey ahead, but it's clear the imperative and need for information is there. So one example that I'll also further dig into is palm oil. And so it's a commodity that we've been looking to, and many have been looking into as a result of the environmental and social impacts. And what you can see here is, and I'll just spell it out real quick, is that transparency is not a trivial thing, and of course visibility is not trivial for any company. No matter how simple the product is, the supply chain is always complex, and being able to provide that information is a challenge. But one thing is to really first get a supply chain map to understand what are the different key points in the supply chain, and what are the leverage we have over those points in the supply chain. And so you can see this built out. This is a project of my doctoral candidate, Yinjin Lee, where there's different numbers of players at each. Let me go back real quick. Number of player at the nodes of the supply chain. So understanding where there are highest numbers of players, obviously at the downstream in this case, when it reaches the producers and the end consumers, but at a certain point in the supply chain, there's a place where players in supply chain can actually leverage that reduced amount of players, and so they can find out more information about upstream practices in the supply chain. So you can see this sort of hourglass as a result of this whole supply chain map for what is now palm oil that goes into many of your shampoo, conditioner, food products, right? It's a very diffuse product, but actually tracing it back can be quite challenging. So we'll just go to the next. And so, on top of that, we're seeing really higher levels of disclosure for traceable palm oil. So it's a key commodity that is very much covered in the news, and as a result of the high environmental and social impact. And so there's been pressure by downstream producers to get more visibility into their palm oil. And so actually we tracked and went through the CSR reports and different disclosure outlets for many major organizations that source palm oil. And what's quite interesting is that there is evidence that move for more supply chain transparency, at least in a very key commodity, is growing. And you can see right here, there are the retailers, of which they sell products that have palm oil in them. The evidence would be that they probably don't have that much visibility, whereas manufacturers, there's been a big increase on to what extent they can trace that palm oil back to the source, back to the plantations where that palm oil is being grown, and be able to understand what's happening on the ground. And of course, this is one case and one key commodity. It's quite a challenge to trace back every single thing in the supply chain back to source. But what is clear here is that there's a demand for that information, and there's a need to be able to have evidence of what you know about your supply chain. And so this is a visual I put out together with another colleague, Leo Bonanni, a MIT alum, on supply chain transparency. And so you can see it really maps sort of the adoption levels of supply chain transparency. Marked by different, I'm going to use my finger because I can't use my mouse to gesture the different pieces on this visual. But what it's really showing here is this transition to a more sustainable, more transparent supply chain. And so, the internal operations is really your own organization's different. What your own organization has control of, and then each on if you look at the lower axes, you can see the different kind of steps towards supply chain transparency, some of which is first the code of conduct, which is just an agreement within the organization, and then eventually with your suppliers, and potentially even further upstream about different practices you're going to abide by and ensure and vet and be in compliance with those different practices. And then the next level, so that's really where a majority of businesses sit as far as we've been tracking. And then you go on to standards and certifications, which is a sort of a minimum standard put in place, a threshold to which yourself and or your suppliers need to abide by, and that you actually check on and have, in some cases, certifications to show compliance to that different level of practice, socially and or environmental. Then upwards, you can see performance-based metrics. Then what we just explored, traceability to source, and then finally full disclosure of the whole supply chain, which is pretty rare in only a few cases that we've seen and have tracked. And if you look at the full disclosure all the way to raw materials, that's really where some of the key actors in this case, I referred back to Patagonia's and other companies that are actually tracing back to raw material. And of course, the challenge here is that full transparency is very challenging to get, but there is an imperative to have more information about what is happening deep in the supply chain, far more than what is in practice right now. I think COVID in particular has made it clear to so many businesses what they don't know about the supply chain and what they need to know better. And as we are building back better, or whatever analogy we want to use, there's a key opportunity to pair this push for visibility, risk management, and preparation to have more supply chain transparency, so that it's not just a risk management approach, it's also future sustainability efforts. They really go hand in hand, and of course not easy to do it in a perfect and very linear way. Nothing is linear in sustainability, and I think we will probably be discussing that for the next few days. But what is clear is that there's a huge opportunity, and it's such a ripe time to be talking about this right now, because there's a demand, there's emerging regulation, there is an imperative coming from different sources to create more supply chain transparency for the long-term sustainability. It really creates a more risk averse and resilient business to have that supply chain transparency. And so, we talked about a few examples today, but I breezed through them, but the evidence that there are more out there, and you see them on the supermarket shelves, you see them when you're virtually shopping this holiday season. Encourage you to think more about the transparency and the requirements to get that transparency, and be able to inform your consumers and your stakeholders about what is happening. And the other part of that I didn't discuss much was that the more that other businesses are moving towards transparency and getting more involved, whether that be through certain different technologies, if we are thinking about things like blockchain or other opportunities to get more scaled transparency across the supply chain, more information sharing, and more collaboration, the more each business does it and it rolls upstream into their suppliers and suppliers, it becomes easier. So when it's a lone game, which is often it is right now, it's one business going alone, it is expensive and it's time consuming and no one's prepared. But as we're seeing in certain industries where there is this drive towards transparency, it becomes easier when it's scaled and there is more adoption across the supply chain. So I really thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about supply chain transparency. This was just a hot snapshot of what we're doing, and I can encourage you if you'd like to reach out to me at any time to discuss this. We have ongoing work, and I think it will be only grow from here. Thanks for your time today.